Welcome back. In this short video, I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'd like to give you some background information on the two authors that we're reading this week. This information is really meant to give you some context in order to understand the two poems that we're reading. But in our discussion board, I really want us to think about the language of the two poems. That is, I want us to begin to closely read them. After I give you some background information, I'm actually going to read the two poems to you. And this is because I think that poetry should really be read aloud. It helps you to understand the rhythm of the poem, and it also helps you to understand the distinction between the sentences and their relationship to the line numbers. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. First of all, the first poem that you're going to be reading is John Donne's Death Be Not Proud. John Donne was a British Renaissance poet. He was a scholar and he was a minister. He lived from 1572 until 1631. And the poem that we're going to be reading was first published in 1633. Now, the John Donne's writing is it's difficult. It's difficult to understand, and it almost sometimes feels like you're sort of headed down a rabbit hole trying to figure out the meaning. Donne is what we call a metaphysical poet, which means that he was interested in things like the nature of man, spirituality, and the universe. And his writing oftentimes uses sort of metaphors that seem to blend into one another almost seamlessly. And he oftentimes presents what appear to be a kind of tornado of ideas. So don't worry if you don't understand the poem fully on the first couple of readings. We're going to begin to elucidate the poem through the process of close reading. Now, the second poem that we're going to be reading is by David Schneidermeyer. David Schneidermeyer is a contemporary American physician, teacher, poet, and bioethicist. He was born in 1955. And he's interested in exploring the intersection of medical ethics and compassion. And he uses literature as a means of addressing his clinical experiences. The poem that we're reading for today is called Duty, and it was published in 1996. So, what I've given you actually are two poems about death and dying, but poems that are written approximately 350 years apart. And I just gave this to you so I want you to see sort of the breadth of the way in which people think about and write about death and dying, and the way in which the poems differ not only artistically, but also in terms of how they present death or present dying. So, as you're reading, I want you to think about two things. One is I want you to compare similarities and differences in the two authors' attitudes about death. And two is I want you to see how each author makes his case about death. In other words, what kinds of literary devices does the author draw upon to create his poetic work? What kinds of tools, like those close reading tools, does the author utilize? So I'm going to read you those two poems aloud, and I'd like for you to follow along. Now, before I do, I have a couple of pieces of advice about reading poetry. One is that poetry usually takes very, very little amount of time to read, but it takes a very long time to fully understand it. So you might read these two in a matter of minutes. You might spend hours thinking about them, and that's just kind of the nature of poetry. Now, we understand poetry largely through unpacking it. I oftentimes will use the term unpacking when I'm talking about close reading, because close reading is a way of revealing meaning to us. And poetry is divided into the following elements, just to orient yourself to the text. First of all, are stanzas. Stanzas are usually several lines of poetry, and they function almost like paragraphs or chapters within a larger work. Then there's individual lines of poetry. And typically there's a specific number of syllables within a line. Also, you'll notice that there may or may not be rhyming within lines. And sometimes what you can find are rhymes that exist within the middle of a line of poetry or rhymes that exist at the end of the poetry. And when we think about poetry, we want to think about why the author has divided up his poetry as he has. That is, why has the author divided up his poetry into these specific stanzas? Why has he divided up the lines as he's divided them? And what's the relationship between the end of the line, a specific line of poetry, and the end of the sentence? Because a line of poetry and a sentence within a poem don't oftentimes fully align with one another. Also, when you're reading poetry, either aloud or within your head, don't stop at the line break. Stop at the end of the sentence because that'll give you a better sense of the rhyme of the sort of rhythm of the poem, and that'll allow you then to think about the poem's meter. All right, so without further ado, I want to read you first the Donne and then the Schneidermeyer. So here's Donne's poem, Death Be Not Proud. It's from the Holy Sonnets. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou thinkest thou dost overthrow die not, poor Death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, and sooner our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls' delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Why swellest thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Okay, so that's our first poem on death. And now I want to read you our second poem, which is Schneidermeyer's Duty. Your husband is obsessed with your care. He waits on you. If he owes you, it is certainly not this much, not this daily washing and turning and feeding. I think this is duty. He was a military man. Perhaps, after all, you are his country now. Maybe this is just patriotic love. I want you to know, even though you are unable to speak, he talks to you and brushes your hair. When you began dying, I put an IV just under the skin of your thigh to keep you a few days longer. It's an old nursing home trick. Raise a goose egg of normal saline and prevent dehydration when you can't find a vein. Both he and I knew it was just an endgame, but we needed time. It was the reverse of induced childbirth, a drip to slow down the delivery. Looking back, I am sorry. But when death came fast anyways, and when it did, we cried. Looked down on you together and he stroked your face. I went to the kitchen, watched the gray squirrels run through the snow. When he shook hands, your husband always lifted up my hand just an inch or two, as if to say, I will take care of it, doctor. Okay, those are our two poems. I'd like you to read them also to yourself, and then to begin to delve into the poems through our discussion board questions. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to talking with you on the discussion board.